and my actions were deeply hurtful to those people who have to live with intolerance every day. Because of the racist history of that type of action, it is never acceptable to darken one's skin, and I should have understood that at the time, and I should never have done it, and I want to extend my deep apologies for that.
CBC News. Last night on the plane, when we asked you if the picture that emerged in the Time report was the only time you had done this, you left us with the impression there was only one other incident. And since then, Global News has released a video which seems to show that there was at least a third incident. So exactly how many times have you darkened your skin with makeup in an act that you have yourself described as racist?
I shared the moments that I recollected, but I recognize that it is something absolutely unacceptable to do. And I appreciate calling it makeup, but it was blackface. And that is just not right. It is something that people who live with the kind of discrimination that far too many people do because of the color of their skin, or their history, or their origins, or their language, or their religion, face on a regular basis. And I didn't see that from the layers of privilege that I have. And for that, I am deeply sorry, and I apologize. Okay. Je reconnais que
I recognize that this is unacceptable. I shared the events I could remember, but the reality is that it will never be acceptable to darken one's skin when there are people out there who live with discrimination every day because of their identity. That's not the person I am, and I should have realized that, and I deeply regret it.
How many times? Is it just the 3 that we know about, or are there more incidents? Because you know people are looking for them. And if a candidate were to come forward now with this in their history, would you allow them to run for the Liberals in this election? I think that's a question that we would look at every step of the way. I think examining the case-by-case situation, examining the actions that someone has taken. I am certainly conscious that in my political career as leader and indeed as Prime Minister, we've taken many concrete actions to fight against racism, to fight against intolerance, to fight against anti-black racism specifically, to recognize unconscious bias and systemic discrimination that exists in Canada and elsewhere, to work to overcome and recognize intersectionalities that people live with in a way that so many of us simply cannot understand or appreciate the microaggressions and the challenges being faced. So even though we've moved forward in significant ways as a government, what I did, the choices I made, hurt people who thought I was an ally. I am an ally, but this is something that obviously I deeply regret and I never should have done. More than 3 times? More than 3 times, yes or no, sir? More than 3 times, yes or no?
Larry Cush, Winnipeg Free Press. Mr. Trudeau, yesterday you said that you didn't realize in 2001 that it was wrong to put on brown face, but now you do realize it is wrong, and I'm wondering when it dawned on you that it is wrong?
I think it's difficult to become a politician where you spend as much time as you will do working hard to represent people, working hard to getting to know a community like the community I have the honor of representing, Papineau, where there is extraordinary diversity, extraordinary challenges, and yes, extraordinary intolerance, even in a city like Montreal, in a country like Canada, that people live with every day. And as I've learned to not just represent people, but to fight for them, and to try and build a better community and a better society, I've learned every day that it is unacceptable to engage in this sort of behavior.
When
Okay. Quand on a l'honneur
When one has the honor of being able to represent a community like the riding of Papineau in Montreal, a multicultural and multi-ethnic riding with people of great diversity, but people who face discrimination almost every single day in their lives. And that responsibility of properly representing them and defending them and working to build a better world has taught me, I learned directly from the people of Papineau that I benefit from privileges, and I did not understand the reality of people. And I'm deeply sorry, and I know that we must all do better as a country, but me in particular, as Prime Minister, I must do better.
Ran in Papineau in 2008, and later when you ran for the leadership in 2015, presumably there was a vetting process. I'm wondering if you thought enough about this issue that you volunteered that to in the vetting process, or did you ever declare that this had happened?
I never talked about this. Quite frankly, I was embarrassed. It was not something that represents the person I've become, the leader I try to be, and it was really embarrassing. J'en ai jamais parlé publiquement.
I never talked about it publicly because I'm very embarrassed about that behavior. It doesn't represent the person that I am and the politician I've become. And I should have known better, but I take full responsibility.
Mr. Trudeau, Teresa Wright from the Canadian Press. You said just a few minutes ago that you told us last night on the plane that of all of the different instances that you recalled, have you since been made aware or remembered of other instances, and if so, how many?
I think it is obvious that this is something that was deeply regrettable. I am wary of being definitive about this because the recent pictures that came out I had not remembered. And I think the question is, how can you not remember that? The fact is, I didn't understand how hurtful this is to people who live with discrimination every single day. I have always acknowledged that I come from a place of privilege, but I now need to acknowledge that that comes with a massive blind spot. I have dedicated my leadership and my service to Canada to try and counter intolerance and racism everywhere I can, but this has been a personally a moment where I've had to reflect on the fact that wanting to do good and wanting to do better simply isn't good enough, and you need to take responsibility for mistakes that hurt people who thought I was an ally, who hopefully many of them still consider me an ally, even though this was a terrible mistake.
The reality is that I can't really be definitive about this because I did not remember the recent photos that came out that were taken when I was in the 1990s. And I occasions because it's extremely frustrating for me to have to recognize that I didn't always meet the expectations I had of myself. In my political life, I've always tried to defend people, to push back against intolerance and discrimination. But I have to recognize that I was blind to the pain that I may have caused at those times and that I am now causing to people that count on me to defend them and not to make them feel badly.
I'd like you to answer a very basic question. You've done this obviously more than 2 times. Why?
I think when we recognize, when we reflect on mistakes we made in the past, that's a question that we're always going to be asking. Why did we do that? Why did we think it was okay? Why did we think it was a good idea at the time? It wasn't a good idea. It was a terrible idea. It was something that minimizes and takes advantage of a reality that I have not had to live with, of being discriminated against, of being marginalized, of being judged for the color of my skin, for my language, my background. I come from a place of privilege, and I have endeavored in my life to put the advantages and the opportunities I've been given to serve this country, to fight for people's rights. And I have to recognize that I let a lot of people down with that choice. And I stand here today to reflect on that and to ask for forgiveness. Okay.
I think this is always the question one must ask oneself when one makes a mistake. Why did I do this? Why did I think this was something I could do or should do? The reality is that it wasn't. But at that time, I did not understand the privilege I had of never being discriminated against for my religion, the color of my skin. I didn't have to experience the intolerance that too many people, even in a country that is open and respectful as Canada is, that they have to experience. And this is the kind of reflection I've engaged in since, and I'm doing everything I can with the opportunities and the benefits I had in my life to serve and to build a better society. But the reality is that I did wound people that I was supposed to defend and help, and I'm very sorry. Now, this morning you spoke to your MPs and your staff and members of the community. What did you say to them, and what was their response? Well, I talked about the things that I'm saying today. Just what a terrible mistake it was, that this is something that I should never have done, that I know that I have colleagues and fellow MPs, friends and allies and community leaders who support me and who are part of this political adventure of trying to build a better society, and who believe very deeply in what we're trying to do. And I know that I hurt them. People who believed in me, who still believe in me, but who have to live with the fact that I hurt them because of the ridiculous choices that I made many years ago. And of course, I told them that I'm deeply sorry for that and that I want to continue to work with them every day to make Canada a better place and to win the trust of Canadians so that we can build a better country. There are people who wrote to you on the social media saying that this is no big deal. Can you perhaps tell us why you feel it's serious and why you feel the need to apologize? Well, there are people like me in the past who had trouble understanding and certainly had never experienced the kind of discrimination that many people experience every day, whether it is members of visible minorities or the LGBTQ community or women or the indigenous peoples. There is still a great deal of discrimination and intolerance in our society that comes out through microaggressions or deliberate actions that are taken. And there are a lot of people who are lucky enough never to see this. But Canadians and everyone have to understand that doing something like darkening your skin trivializes and takes advantage of a reality that many people cannot escape, that many people face every day. And I think this is certainly something that I learned over the years as I was representing and serving people of different backgrounds. And this is the kind of reflection many people should engage in.
There's a bit of confusion about the timeline of all of this. And I'm just wondering when you first told your campaign staff that there are these images of you out there that could be embarrassing if they were to come out in an election campaign. Did you know about this in 2015? Did you know about this before then? When did you tell those people that?
As I said, I was embarrassed, particularly given the person that I've become and the leader I try to be, that fights for people's rights and defends people against intolerance and racism. And I didn't want to talk about it with anyone because I'm not that person anymore. I'm someone who understands the deep hurt caused by actions like that to people who live with discrimination every single day. When we found out that Time magazine was looking for a picture of that event, I told my staff. But ultimately, the call is mine on when to talk to people, when to act on things, and the buck stops with me, and I take responsibility.
You had a privileged upbringing. You went to good schools. Your father was Prime Minister and an internationalist. And I'm wondering if he knew that you were doing this in high school, appearing in blackface, and what he thought about it. And if he didn't know, what do you think he would have thought about it? My father raised me to try and defend people's rights. One of our family mottos has always been provide counterweights. It was the reason he gave for why he chose to go to Ottawa in 1965 when all the power tended to accrue towards Quebec City in the Quiet Revolution and Quebecers becoming strong and staying in Quebec. He said, no, we need to provide counterweights. And if you're strong, you need to go where your strength is most needed. That is the way he raised me, and I certainly have tried to use the privilege that you talk about, the opportunities that I've had in my life, to put them in service of people who didn't have the kinds of opportunities that I have. That's the kind of leader and the kind of Prime Minister I've tried to be, the kind of man I've tried to be, certainly the kind of parent I've tried to be. And in my conversations with my kids, a difficult conversation I had this morning about taking responsibility for your actions and learning from your mistakes. This is certainly something that I think my father wouldn't be pleased with how I behaved, but perhaps would feel that taking responsibility for things is important. When I think of the conversations I had with my kids this morning, I also recognize that there are far too many Canadians who this morning had to explain to their kids what those pictures were of their Prime Minister and what kind of society we live in and what kind of world we need to live in and how things have evolved. But at the same time, I regret deeply
parents who had to have difficult conversations with their kids that were uncomfortable and hurtful because of my actions.
Michelle Zilio with the Globe and Mail. In 2001, students were being expelled for wearing blackface and brownface from schools. There was also a Spike Lee movie about it in 2001. When did you realize that blackface was racist?
I think, as I've said, the privilege of representing the community of Papineau, a extraordinarily multicultural community where any given crowd looks a lot like this crowd here in Winnipeg, of people of every different background, of every different origin, and the responsibility of not just sticking up for people of all different backgrounds, but fighting for them and defending them is something that made it very, very clear to me that minimizing or further marginalizing people by dressing up that way is absolutely unacceptable.
As a follow-up, international media, including the BBC, New York Times, and Al Jazeera, have published stories about this. Are you concerned that your behavior, including, not talking about this for 18 years publicly, has damaged Canada's reputation? And if so, what will you do about it?
I think we all need to recognize that even in an incredible country like Canada, there's still a lot of more work to do. People are still facing discrimination and marginalization every single day. Anti-black racism, unconscious bias, systemic discrimination, they still exist. Systemic discrimination still exists in our schools, in our universities, in our workplaces, in our communities. Racialized Canadians every day face extra barriers, extra comments, disparaging remarks that they have learned to live with as the reality of their day-to-day lives. And we must all, in Canada and everywhere around the world, pledge ourselves to make sure we are fighting to make it better. That there's lots of things we can and must do. That includes recognizing terrible mistakes of the past. That's what I am doing. That's what I have tried to do as Prime Minister in many occasions. And that's why we're going to continue to recognize that still Indigenous peoples in this country face unacceptable living situations, fewer opportunities. These people who were promised shared partnership and stewardship of the land and respect were treated with everything but for centuries. And we are beginning on the road of reconciliation now, but there is still a long way to go. Canadians who come from different parts of the world, whether they're first generation or fifth generation, continue to face intolerance and marginalization. We have much more to do, and I am not afraid of standing up in front of the world and saying, Canada's a pretty great country, Canada's the best country in the world, but we have a lot more work to do, all of us. And that is something that I will continue to pledge every single day I have to doing.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Earlier this week, child advocates from across the country came together to say that the federal government is not doing enough to address youth suicides. If the Liberals are re-elected, will you implement a national suicide strategy prevention plan? And if so, when would you implement that and what would it look like?
We've made significant moves forward on this terrible tragedy. There are far too many communities across the country where children are taking their lives, where suicidal ideation, where lack of opportunities, societal and intergenerational inequities have led to unacceptable rates of youth suicides and tremendous tragedies for families, for communities. We need to do a better job of addressing. And yes, we continue to move forward on things like national strategies to prevent youth suicide, but it takes more than just strategies. It takes concrete investments, which is why we've made investments in mental health service workers, in a hotline to help out for Indigenous communities, in investments in education and in new schools and in new health centers, and investments in Indigenous languages and culture, recognizing that someone who is proud of their identity and their language and can use their language is far less likely to fall victim to suicidal ideation and suicides. But the problem continues. We need to do much, much more, and we will continue to do much, much more if we get that opportunity.
Also this week, a new report was released in Manitoba showing that First Nations people are dying at younger rates than non-Indigenous people. But we know that that's happening across the board in Canada. And this continues to happen since the Liberals have been in power for the past 4 years. If re-elected, what are you going to do to change that?
We have made significant progress over the past 4 years on tangible things like lifting boil water advisories. We've lifted 87 long-term boil water advisories in Indigenous communities, but there's still more than 50 to go, although we feel we are on track to lifting all those that remain by the 5-year mark in the spring of 2021 that we had committed to. We are investing in new schools. We're investing in new health centers. We are investing in better partnerships in support for First Nations and Indigenous post-secondary education. We're working directly with the Métis Nation on economic development and investments. We're moving forward on an urban and Indigenous strategy as well to recognize all those Indigenous peoples who face real challenges in our urban environments. There is so much more to do. We have taken meaningful steps forward that have made a significant difference in the lives of many Indigenous people, but we are the first to recognize there is still a long way to go. What took generations and indeed centuries to break, it's going to take time to fix. And I am impatient, but I also know the only way to move forward properly is in full partnership with Indigenous peoples, is empowering Indigenous communities themselves to determine the right path forward for them. And that sometimes takes a little bit longer because in many cases these communities have never been asked what it is that they want before. So we will work with them and be there to respect them, to empower them, and to build the future that they choose, not the future that we think from Ottawa would be the right future for them. That takes a little longer, I will admit, and every day longer we take means more kids struggling for longer. But we have to get this right, and we have to do it in the full spirit of respect and partnership, and that is what our government has been focused on and will continue to be focused on.
David Aiken from Global News. Good morning, or good afternoon, Prime Minister. I know there'll be a lot of people here today of all races who will be very happy to hear you denounce racism in all its form and your earlier behavior. But the Prime Minister's job was not created so you could work through your issues. Maybe it's time that you realize you're not the indispensable man. As the leader of the Liberal Party, as the Prime Minister, you have very many capable leaders in your party, that perhaps you should step aside for some reflection, for some more understanding and discussion. Have you considered asking someone else to lead the party in this election?
I spent the morning speaking with candidates, with fellow Liberals, with allies, with leaders within racialized communities across the country, and I will continue to do the work that is necessary to keep us moving forward in the right way. Canadians have an important choice to make. Canadians have an important choice to make on October 21st. And I trust Canadians to make that right choice. I certainly hope that they will continue to support us in the work that we're doing, but they might not. And I know that that is something that all Canadians get to decide. And they get to bring in all sorts of different factors because every Canadian has a different way of looking at what matters to them. And all I hope for is that Canadians take very seriously this responsibility and this choice that we will make as a country on October 21st. And until then, I will continue to put forward the very best team, the very best approach that I can to talk about how we're going to build a better future for Canadians.
I'd like to just follow up on the tone now of the campaign. It had a different tone until yesterday, and that tone was largely involved with your party finding lots of very questionable behaviors from many of your opponents, one of them right here in Winnipeg and Winnipeg North. Can you tell us how the tone is going to change as we start talking about things? Is it going to be so important to be digging up people's social media posts of the last 2, 3, 4 years? Are you going to be focused on that, or your party, pardon me, going to be focused on that?
Over the past 3 days, we have put forward significant policy announcements on how we will continue to do the work that we laid out over the past 4 years, work that resulted in creating over 1 million jobs and lifting 900,000 people out of poverty. We talked about raising the Canada Child Benefit for kids under 1, to make sure that more parents have the ability to give all the opportunities to their kids. We talked about doubling our investments in childcare so that there is better help for after school and before school care for parents who need it. And we've talked about supporting our seniors by increasing the old age security by 10% for seniors once they reach 75, because we recognize that costs continue to go up. We're going to continue to make contrasts with our opponents. We're going to continue to put forward strong pieces of policy that will demonstrate how we believe that investing in Canadians is the right path forward. But we will always and continue to do that in a way that pushes back against intolerance and racism every step of the way.
Last question.
Mr. Trudeau, the next time you're in a mosque or temple, how can you look at those people and tell them that you fully understand what they're going through?
That is a question I've had to answer from the very first time I had the opportunity to walk into a gurdwara or a mandir or a mosque in my riding and across the country. When people see someone who came from a place of privilege asking for the opportunity to represent them in the House of Commons, asking them for the opportunity to be their voice, even though obviously I'm someone who has had tremendous opportunities and advantages in my life. And that conversation I had that started over 10 years ago when I started my journey to being a politician is a conversation I need to continue to have every single day whenever I meet a voter, whenever I meet a Canadian, whenever I meet someone who is looking to me to serve them, to defend them, to represent them, and to build a better future with them. And I look forward to continuing these conversations that I get to have with Canadians from coast to coast to coast every single day as I travel across this country.
Just a follow-up. Sorry.
En français? Ah, excusez. La question de comment je pourrais bien représenter.
How I can properly represent someone who's so different from me is a question that I had to answer right from the beginning when I entered politics. I'm someone who's enjoyed a lot of privileges, and wanting to represent as diverse a community as Papineau with all its economic challenges, well, I had to show that I was there to put my voice and my abilities to their service, to serve people who didn't have those privileges and opportunities. And in the last 12 years as a politician and 4 years as a Prime Minister, I have shown what I can do to represent people of all different backgrounds. I can always do better, but that is at the very core of what I'm doing now and will continue to do.
You've apologized, but what policies and procedures would you enact that are anti-racism? Because as you can tell, there's people who have been affected by this.
Indeed. We were the first Canadian government to recognize the UN Decade of People of African Descent. We were the first government to specifically put forward $25 million over the coming years for the Black community to support grassroots community organizations and create opportunities for Black youth. We put forward a national anti-racism strategy that talks about anti-Black racism, that talks about anti-Semitism, talks about Islamophobia. We have moved forward in a significant way in partnership with a broad range of Canadians of all sorts of diversities and their groups. But we recognize, as you point out, there is always much more to do, and we will keep doing it. The choices we make on building a better future for all Canadians continues to be something that we are very much focused on as a country, as a government, and as a party. And we will continue to focus on that. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Prime Minister,
Thank you, everyone.
Next time.
Liberal leader Justin Trudeau taking questions from the media in Winnipeg today following these pictures and video that have emerged of Justin Trudeau in blackface or brownface. Justin Trudeau had to say that it's always unacceptable to darken your face. He said, to those Canadians who are the victims of intolerance every day, my actions were deeply hurtful because of the racist history, that it's never acceptable to darken your face. He said, I shared the moments that I recollected. I appreciate calling it makeup, but it was blackface. He said, I didn't see that from the layers of privilege that I have. He said, I never talked about this publicly, frankly, because I was embarrassed. It's not the person I've become or the politician I've become. He was asked whether his father, Pierre Trudeau, knew about this, and he said that his father would have been very disappointed in him. The CBC's Karina Roman joins us now live. So, Karina, what stood out for you?
Well, definitely different from last night. You know, willing to actually say blackface instead of just talking about putting makeup on. You know,
he almost not to interrupt you. Sorry to interrupt, but he almost kind of a reporter sort of said, you know, darken your face. He's like, I appreciate you calling it, you know, makeup or whatever.
He called it that yesterday as well.
Did.
So you know, this time he's doing that. He's actually addressing right from the beginning. He came out and addressed who he hurt. You know, he didn't really talk much about who he might hurt in his actions. Last night it was about regretting them and saying he was sorry, but today talking about, you know, much more about who he probably hurt with these photos and with his actions. I also definitely him owning up to the layers of privilege and the privileged background he came from, trying to pivot it to say, you know, and have you tried to use that privilege for good? Certainly that, saying he still hopes that people realize he's an ally in the fight against racism and discrimination. You know, but there was also, you know, he couldn't answer why. You know, if there's more than one incident, why did you do it? Even if you didn't realize, like, what was the motivation behind doing it? And he said, you know, it's a question we often ask ourselves, but he didn't really have an answer for, you know, why he did it, why he would have, you know, gone into blackface or brownface in the costumes that he did. And, you know, the other thing is, you know, he was asked to respond to those people who might actually say this is no big deal. And, you know, that's a hard question to answer because, you know, he doesn't want people, you know, like people who don't think it's a big deal, I suppose he doesn't want to convince them that it is a big deal because, you know, that's not something he'd want to do. But he had to say that, you know, it is significant and he recognizes that. And, you know, there are many people who might not realize, as he did in the past, not realize how offensive and how hurtful this could be.
Karina, there is also, and I didn't sum this part up because I was waiting for us to get the clip ready, because there's also been questions about how many times. David Cochrane asked him last night, are there other moments? He mentioned one other moment, and then it surfaced today that there was actually a third instance, and then David Cochrane was trying to get an answer from him. Are there others? Like, are there anything else? He didn't get an answer after asking him a few times, and then I believe it was a Canadian press reporter.
Yeah, Teresa Wright. Yeah.
Who asked again a few minutes later, and this is what Justin Trudeau had to say.
You said just a few minutes ago that you told us last night on the plane that of all of the different instances that you recalled, have you since been made aware or remembered of other instances, and if so, how many?
I think it is obvious that this is something that was deeply regrettable. I am wary of being definitive about this because the recent pictures that came out, I had not remembered. And I think the question is, how can you not remember that? The fact is, I didn't understand how hurtful this is to people who live with discrimination every single day. I have always acknowledged that I come from a place of privilege, but I now need to acknowledge that that comes with a massive blind spot. I have dedicated my leadership and my service to Canada to try and counter intolerance and racism everywhere I can. But this has been a personally a moment where I've had to reflect on the fact that wanting to do good and wanting to do better simply isn't good enough, and you need to take responsibility for mistakes that hurt people who thought I was an ally, who hopefully many of them still consider me an ally, even though this was a terrible mistake.
And so that is Justin Trudeau, Karina, answering that question. I think that's very interesting. It could be interesting to people who say, I'm wary of being definitive on the number of times. In other words, there could be more.
Yeah, there could be more. And, you know, obviously the question then is, well, how can you not remember these? And him trying to, frame it that, well, because I didn't realize how significant these moments were and how hurtful and his blind spot, as he characterized it, I guess he didn't remember these incidents and these events. Although then on the flip side, he was asked, if, these pictures were out there, how come you never told anyone about them? In fact, someone brought up, the vetting process when he was running to be MP, and he said, well, I was embarrassed. So, he definitely remembered some of these incidents and knew these pictures existed, and says he was so embarrassed he didn't want to talk about them publicly before. And this has obviously forced his hand. But I guess also acknowledging there might be other incidents that he doesn't remember because he didn't understand the significance of them at the time. He also did talk, I should mention, about, his conversation with his children this morning, that last night he had said he would have, and that, it was a difficult conversation to have and about taking responsibility for your mistakes. But he also talked about how he regrets that means parents across the country were going to have to explain to their kids why their prime minister, why there's photos like this of their prime minister. So that was another point that he brought up. He also was asked, when did you realize this was wrong? And he never gave a specific moment. He kind of talked about, well, as when I was MP and became MP, for Papineau, which is a very diverse riding, and he's not actually been MP for that long, I mean, it was 2013 when he was elected MP, so I'm not sure whether he's saying I didn't really realize it till I started becoming an MP for Papineau, or whether it was before, but he wasn't definitive on when he realized that, what he did was racist.
I mean, some people have been reflecting over this over the past less than 24 hours, saying, all right, maybe high school, but 29 years old at the school, like there's a difference in terms of how old you are, frankly, when you make some of these decisions. You mentioned his conversation with his children. It was also interesting that he was asked about whether his father, former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, knew that he was doing this, that he was wearing blackface. This is how he responded to that.
In my conversations with my kids, difficult conversation I had this morning about taking responsibility for your actions and learning from your mistakes. This is certainly something I think my father wouldn't be pleased with how I behaved, but perhaps would feel that taking responsibility for things is important.
So that was a moment. People may or may not remember that official multiculturalism was brought in by Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, and so it's just interesting that we're having this moment, and that question was asked, I think, in that spirit. What are other Liberal MPs saying about this, Karina?
Well, he did, as you mentioned, he had a phone call or separate phone calls this morning with his fellow candidates, with staff, with members of the communities that, would be hurt by this. And certainly his Liberal MPs that are coming out, as those who are from diverse minority groups, have seemed to rally around him and say that they accept his apology. We've heard from Ikra Khalid, who's a Mississauga Erin Mills candidate and MP looking for re-election, Harjit Sajjan and Greg Fergus. Have a listen to what they have been saying.
Regardless of what time, when it happened, it was wrong then. It's wrong now. But I'm also here to talk about the person who I know. In terms of how much he has standing up for people, you need to be judged for your actions.
When I read that story, I really automatically went back to the past 4 years, and I did watch the Prime Minister's apology, and I felt it to be very sincere. What happened 18 years ago does not take away from the past 4 years.
I don't believe that anybody has ever lived their lives without making an error or without making errors. The Prime Minister last night presented his apologies. He expressed his regrets. I think the real measure of the man, and the thing that I think that we need to be talking about, and I hope that you'll be talking about, are all the amazing things which we've done for diversity, specifically for the Black Canadian community across this country.
So this is an election campaign, which might explain also why, of course, the candidates and Liberal MPs would be rallying around their leader. And certainly in his news conference this afternoon, it is still an election campaign, and Justin Trudeau saying he hopes that voters will still stick with him and stick with the Liberal Party, even though this has happened. He understands they may not, but he's hoping that he can win their forgiveness and understanding, because obviously the campaign continues.
It does. 31 more days, if I'm counting correctly. All right, Karina, thank you. The CBC's Karina Roman, live in Ottawa. People across the country are also reacting to the images of Trudeau in blackface and brownface. Zach Gowdy has been speaking to people on the streets of St. John's and joins us now. So, Zach, what are you hearing from people?
Well, Andrew, first thing this morning, I paid a visit to the campus of Memorial University. It is one of the most diverse places in what is a very white province after all, and we made a special effort there to speak with people of color. I spoke with 9 such individuals, and certainly we got a very diverse range of reaction on this issue. Many people looked at that image of Justin Trudeau in brown face makeup and said this was a dumb thing to have done even 20 years ago, that it was an inappropriate thing for a teacher to do at a school function, and that it's certainly not the image the Prime Minister of Canada should be projecting to the world. And still other people of color told me that for them the image was not offensive, that they didn't consider it to be racially insensitive, that they felt that the portrayal Justin Trudeau was doing there again was something that they could forgive, that they accepted his apology, and even others who saw Justin Trudeau, the politician, as a champion of multiculturalism and said these images don't automatically erase that. Now, as a journalist and as a white person, it's not for me to interpret those comments, but I did think it was an interesting reminder that there is a range of opinions on this subject, and they don't break down neatly along racial lines.